back at one of my favorite cathedrals in nature. That's the Conoy in the distance, and the Pennsylvania Canal in the foreground. We've had some torrential rains in the last week, and the Conoy is raging.
Hello everybody, and welcome to this episode of your Pennsylvania Canal Hunter.
Down there is the Prism. There are some stone remnants I can see here. I'll go in for a closer look. Here are some of the stone remnants that I mentioned in the towpath bank. There are some more here. So there's no doubt that this was the Prism.
It's a privilege to have you join me for the third video in my Pennsylvania Canal Hunter series, featuring my original footage of nearly 200-year-old remnants, primarily along the so-called Western Division of Pennsylvania's Main Line. This Western Division is a 104-mile waterway from Johnstown to Pittsburgh. I've also visited some sites along the other two canal divisions and the two railroad divisions of the Main Line, which combine to connect Pittsburgh all the way to Philadelphia. Although it's my third video, I'm calling it episode 2 because the first video was an introduction, episode 0, about me and how I stumbled into the 195-year-old traces of the past.
That simply has to be some kind of drainage system from the canal, which is up above that rock. And it's still here in 2022. The water is actually still flowing.
My second video, named episode 1, introduced the towpath on which animals walked to tow canal boats. I featured remnants of the towpath banks, which separate the canal ditch from the river it follows. Some of those clips prominently showed the ditch itself, and that is where I'll pick up this episode in a minute. The ditch and banks were made of dirt and clay, so their remnants are only a shadow of what they once were. But some more durable structures have survived nicely, among which are stone culverts, the second main topic in this episode. These are elegant structures where the canal intersects with streams flowing down valley hillsides toward the river. In this illustration from the topography lesson in episode 1, remember that the canal route followed rivers. So all the tributary streams intersected the path of the canal.
That's looking across the Conoy River at 7:30 on a mid-April night. That's where the stream meets the river. Tracing it back toward the culvert. There it is.
What were culverts doing at these intersections? Now let's begin the first topic. In this footage from episode 1, I labeled the canal channel as the ditch, but the technical engineering term, which you'll see in literature about canals, is the prism. Why? To answer that, here's another animation from the last episode. I showed this to help you understand the diagram, which is called a cross-section, like a slice through the earth, slicing across the canal and banks and river. In the diagram, notice that the canal channel has a flat bottom, but its walls are slanted, not vertically straight up and down. Therefore, the shape of its cross-section is not rectangular. It's another kind of four-sided quadrilateral. You've likely heard of a prism, a kind of glass or crystal that splits light into its rainbow spectrum. This one is called a triangular prism for obvious reasons. This type of geometric shape is also called a prism, technically a trapezoidal prism, because its face at the end is shaped like a trapezoid, but we'll just call it a prism. If you flip it over, it represents the geometry of a canal ditch, and that is why canal people long ago called the canal ditch or channel the prism. How deep was the prism? In my footage, it's hard to get a sense for how high the remnants of the prism banks are. Moreover, these 170-year-old remains are called remnants because they're just ghosts of their original size. In most places I've visited, the towpath mounds are only 2 or 3 feet high. And, of course, water in the prism could be no higher than the towpath. Even depictions from the canal era don't really reveal the prism depth. You might be able to tell that the bank is about 2 feet higher than the water level. A 2-foot clearance of the towpath above the water level was specified in historical documents from that era. Such design plans specify that the water must also be at least 4 feet deep. So, in their time, the banks rose 6 feet above the floor of the prism. That's a lot higher than 2 or 3 foot remnants today. Why have the banks worn down to these mounds half their original depth? I don't think it's as simple as just the banks wearing down. For more than a century and a half, the rains have washed some bank into the prism itself. That runoff builds up on the prism floor, so it's shallower now. Think about what else is built up in the prism. 160 seasons of fallen leaves and branches. Bamboo and a bunch of other bushes grow and die there every year, and then just sit there, layer on layer. So remnants are a combination of breaking down the bank and raising up the prism floor. I've seen a unique remnant which really got me thinking that the prism floors were once a lot lower. In this clip, I describe a small stone-lined opening to a drainage tunnel through the towpath bank. I think you'll see that generally it's a lot lower than today's ground in the prism. I haven't seen any description or illustration of this kind of structure, so I'm not positive, but I think it had to be at the original bottom of the prism, like a drain hole. That means the height from the hole to the top of the bank is a pretty good hint of how high the towpath bank was above the bottom of the prism originally.
Lovely view of the prism.
Here, the prism is about 2 feet deep, generally. In both banks, there's stone wall remnants you can notice as the video plays. Parts of the walls seem close to the tops of the bank mounds, like the walls protected the mounds from erosion by decades of rain. I'm not saying stones haven't been removed from the wall tops, but if they haven't, the banks are close to their original height. That would mean we're looking at the top 2 feet of the banks, and the prism floor would have been 4 feet lower here.
It's a lovely view of the prism. And in none of my prior visits here have I seen this, but the standing water that's in the prism is draining upstream this way, and in fact goes into this deep hole. And it is quite deep. I'm sorry about the sun glare. Maybe from the side it won't be so bad. So that's the towpath with some residual stone wall here. And much deeper than that. Get it all in one frame. Is a hole with stone around it to define it. And that is draining water from the prism, some standing water from recent heavy rainfall. All right, so once again, there's the prism. Down here is the large hole, which the 1992 study calls a waste gate. We're going to walk to the other side of the towpath now. Here's a view down the towpath, and now we'll go and look on this downside of the towpath. Side of it. Looks like it might be green the last time I was here. But obviously that opening out of which the water is flowing is constructed. And given that there's a stream coming there, I don't think there ever was another block there. I think this was intended to be a so-called waste gate.
Future episodes will include much more about prisms, like theory calculations, their designs, construction, and operations. These aren't just ditches with dirt banks, and that's why their remnants have survived 2 centuries of weather and wild growth and can still hold water, at least where later construction hasn't obliterated them. But now it's time to introduce you to the second topic of this episode, culverts. These actually had to be constructed before the prism, as tunnels buried beneath it, to carry streams that would otherwise wash into the prism, flooding it, overflowing and wrecking towpath banks, and carrying material that would clog the flow of water and boats in the prism.
We see culverts all the time, we just don't recognize them as such. Here's one a couple blocks from my house. Nice ornate stonework. Its purpose is simply to get water underneath that walkway. One reason we don't realize how common they are is because our perspective is on the walkway or the roadway, and we don't think from the perspective of the water. We think of this as a way to cross over the water. What a culvert is a tunnel that gets the water underneath the impediment of our sidewalk, our railroad tracks, and it keeps it from building up and forming big puddles, standing water, swamps. There's another one just down the tracks. That's a way for water to get under the things that we build in front of it.
From my hometown of Oakmont, I'll take you 18 river miles up the Allegheny, just past an awesome small town named Freeport. Here, the last major tributary flows into the Allegheny River, at the mouth of the Kiskiminetas River, the Kiski for short. The canal crossed the river over an aqueduct just downstream of today's Allegheny Lock and Dam number 5. We're going to hunt along the canal route about a mile up the Kiski in search of a ravine visible by satellite, but I'm flying you there at an altitude that's level with the top of the valley carved by the river. That's right, your Pennsylvania Canal Hunter has a new hunting weapon. We're looking for a ravine in the valley hillside which carries a stream toward the river. The stream's path intersects the former canal's path. Like many such streams that flow into rivers below, it has no name. But when they're substantial, they're marked on hydrology maps of the U.S. Geological Survey. It makes my heart weep to say it, but the culvert here is the closest physical canal remnant to Pittsburgh. Every physical hint of the canal has been obliterated for a full 30 miles. Let's now land on the ground for a full look around. And here's what we've come to see. Notice that inside the square frame is a circular stone tunnel. That pipe-like structure is the original canal remnant. It was so sturdy and perfectly built 195 years ago that decades later, when railroad was built on the canal bed, they just kept it in place and only added the square framing on the outside. It's still flowing today beneath this long-abandoned rail bed.
I'm standing right above the culvert, and they've ripped up the railroad tracks. But if I understand the 1991 study, this was the towpath.
Here's a look up the ravine that I just panned by. And just to the left, here I've stepped into the ditch where the water meets the rail bank. But the stream flowing down that long ravine in the valley hillside doesn't pool here because
It's the other side of that same culvert. If I can get there, low enough you can see daylight on the other side. See the opposite end of the culvert. Still plenty of water.
So, if I've explained this sufficiently, this gravel trail was once a railroad built on top of the canal. The canal would have been flooded or washed out by the stream flowing down the hillside, intersecting its path. To prevent that, the stream was directed under the canal through this stone pipe tunnel from one side to the other. This tunnel is called a culvert. When a stream flows across the path on which you want to build a canal, there's nothing practical about rerouting the stream over the canal. How about through it? Streams carry sediment and debris that would build up in the prism, not to mention how turbulence or floods would damage the banks. So a culvert is built before constructing the prism. If we were to slice through the earth along the culvert lengthwise, the cross-section would look like this. Boats would float in the prism, in and out of the screen, while the intersecting stream would flow beneath the canal, left and right, within the culvert tunnel. Of course, then, culverts must be built before constructing a prism, which means we can't appreciate the remarkable craftsmanship of the tunnel. And the buried tunnel isn't the first thing we would see. Instead, we see the openings at the ends of the tunnel, and builders often took great pride in making these facades attractive. You've already seen some examples in my footage, and here are two again from the Western Division, just downstream of White Station on the West Penn Trail.
You can hear some audible water flow up there. Just spectacular craftsmanship. Look at how tight these seams are in that arch. How perfectly circular that arch is. It's like it was built by modern machines. And that is the towpath right behind it. This is a beautiful remnant, and I'm kind of surprised at how large the stones are, since these were built with no machinery. And look at how the arch is holding up. I'll go in for a closer look at that. It's unbelievable that that has stood for almost 200 years now. What a brilliantly designed and brilliantly chiseled stone. And there's the culvert, the canal culvert. Let's go in for a look. Again, this spectacular craftsmanship just astonishes me. How perfectly round that is, and how beautiful those seams are. 200 years ago. Dug and fashioned and laid by hand.
As I mentioned, if you're squatting at the opening of a culvert tunnel, it's damn near impossible to appreciate the ridiculous detail in constructing the tunnel itself. So here's an example from the UK, showing repairs on a culvert's caved-in tunnel after digging up the prism. You can read the story if you search for Restoration of the Cocklemore Culvert. And now, to end this episode on the Prism and Culverts, let's appreciate the remarkable interior of a buried culvert tunnel on the actual Pennsylvania Canal. I'm stupidly excited to show you an unexpected discovery I made as I rushed to beat nightfall hunting remnants on the canal's eastern division about 16 miles down the Susquehanna River from Harrisburg. I was hunting the Bainbridge Lock No. 4 at Conoy Canal Park, and just downstream of the lock I discovered this gold mine.
Seems too good to be true. There's water flowing down the prism here, but there's also some coming through a culvert over there, and that is definitely canal era culvert work, although it looks like bricks. I've definitely seen culverts lined like that. There's even evidence of timber, I think, on the floor maybe. Let's see if I can get a closer look there. Right below this wall. This really gives a great visualization for how the culverts were built beneath the canal surface. So I bet the bottom of that upper stone wall was the bottom of the prism maybe. And 4 or 6 feet below that is where they dug the culvert tunnel. And holy bonus, it goes into a culvert tunnel right here. That stone cracks me up. It looks like brick, but it's not. I wish it wasn't so dark out. I'll go exploring up the prism that way a little farther. There's definitely stonework off to the right of that extant wall. But down that way is where the lock is, so I gotta hunt through these thorny thickets, see if I can get a better view of them. That's the towpath bank. And this might be the deepest prism I've stood in out in the wild. Back there's that wicked cool culvert. It's not even 30 or 40 yards. It's where that culvert was. So I'm pretty sure I'm probably standing pretty close to where the bottom of the prism was.
And that teaser, showing a towering 200-year-old stone canal lock deep in the woods near a mighty river, is where, with my unspeakable gratitude for your stamina and interest, we conclude this episode of Your Pennsylvania Canal Hunter.